Why is Goblin Piledriver never sad? Because he has protection from the blues.
This video is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. With free weekly content and free shipping over $100, you can save 5% site-wide by using the promo code MTGMudsta. I'm also sponsored by Face to Face Games, Canada's premier Magic the Gathering store. Using the promo code MTGMudsta will get you 5% off site-wide, with eligible orders getting free shipping Canada-wide. If you're looking for a direct way to help the channel, please consider joining my Patreon and becoming a member of the generic Goblin Gang. Hey gang, and welcome back. Today's game has Chris playing his Brion Stout Arm deck, and he wants to steal creatures from his opponents and then fling them at their faces for great effect. Shane has brought back his super thematic He Who Hungers deck, with the on-point basics, not to mention focusing heavily on soul shift cards. Ben is playing Kyodai Soul of Kamigawa, and I believe it's based around playing a lot of lands, and it's just 5-color good stuff. Last but not least, I've got Shorikai, Genesis Engine, which focuses on playing lots of vehicles and smashing face. Chris wins the die roll and starts us off. He draws, plays a Plateau, and casts an Esper Sentinel. Shane just plays a Swamp. I play an Ancient Den, and cast my own Esper Sentinel, passing to Ben. Ben plays a Wooded Foothills, and passes. Chris draws, plays a Mountain, and casts Talisman of Conviction, but can't pay for my Sentinel trigger, so I draw a card. Moving to combat, he pokes Shane for 1 and passes. Shane draws and plays another Swamp. He then casts Arcane Signet, not paying for either the Esper Sentinels, and Chris and I draw. He then passes after that. I play a Razortide Bridge and go to combat. I swing my Sentinel at Ben for 1, and he fetches in response to find Spire's headquarters, and then takes the one after that. I move to discard and pass. Ben draws and casts a Soul Ring, not paying for the Esper Sentinels, and we get to draw some cards. He then plays the World Tree and passes. Chris plays a Plains and casts Brion, and then swings the Esper Sentinel at Shane again for 1 and passes. Shane draws and plays a Swamp. He then casts a Pitiless Plunderer, passing. I play a Castle Ardenvale for turn and cast Ethereum Sculptor and go to combat. I swing 1 at Ben and pass. Ben draws and plays Yavimaya Cradle of Growth. He then plays a Smothering Tithe. He decides to spite me, paying only for my Sentinel trigger, and passes. Chris draws and doesn't pay for the Tithe, and plays a Mountain for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist, which has Ben cracking his treasure in response for a black mana. Chris then gets 7 treasures, and uses some of it for a generous gift, targeting Smothering Tithe, but doesn't pay for my Sentinel. This has me drawing a card, and Ben gaining another treasure. Ben responds by using his floating mana to cast Entomb for a Life from the Loam, and puts it into the graveyard, and the Tithe then gets destroyed. After that, Chris plays an Arcane Signet, and goes to combat. He swings his commander at Ben, dealing 4, and gains 4, and with that, Chris passes. Shane draws and plays a Thought Vessel, paying for the Sentinel triggers. He passes after that. I play an island for turn, and then cast my commander, Shorikai, and pass. Ben dredges his life from the loam instead of drawing, and then casts it and pays for the Sentinel triggers. He brings back 3 lands, and then plays a Lotus Field, sacrificing the World Tree and Yavimaya, and passing to Chris. Chris plays an Archaeomancer's map in his main phase, paying for my Sentinel trigger. He gets 2 plains to put to hand, and then plays 1 for turn, before casting Skullclamp. Going to combat, he swings Brion and the Dark Side at Ben, dealing 5 and gaining some life after that. With nothing else, he passes. Shane draws and plays a tapped Crypt of Agadeem, and then casts He Who Hungers. I respond to the commander being on the stack by activating Shorikai, drawing 2, discarding a card, and making a pilot, and Shane passes. I play a mech hanger for turn, and then cast an unlicensed hearse, paying the 1 for the sentinel. I then activate it, exiling life from the loam, and entomb from Ben's graveyard, and pass after that. Ben plays a flooded strand, cracking it and losing 1 for an island. He overloads a Vandal Blast, paying for my sentinel trigger, but I respond by countering it with an Arcane Denial. Ben passes after that. On Chris's upkeep, Ben draws 2 and I draw 1 from the Arcane Denial, and Chris then draws for turn. He plays a Carry Zev's Expertise and targets He Who Hungers, and Shane responds by casting Sickening Shoal, pitching Kokai, and targets Brion. This has Chris responding by casting Kazul's Fury to sacrifice Brion and kills my sentinel. The Expertise then resolves, and Chris then steals the commander and casts Illusionist Bracers for free thanks to it. Going to combat, he swings He Who Hungers at Shane and deals 3, and then equips the clamp to it post-combat. He then sacrifices it to its own ability and uses its Thoughtseize-like effect on Ben. Ben responds by channeling Beseiju and targets my unlicensed hearse, destroying it before revealing his hand. Chris then makes him discard March of the Otherworldly Light and passes to Shane. Shane plays a swamp and then plays a Baku altar, paying the 1. This lets him put a counter onto the altar, and moving to combat, he swings the traitor at Chris and then passes after that. I draw and play an island. I cast Katsumasa and pass to Ben. Ben draws and plays Punishing Fire and targets the Esper Sentinel, paying the 1. He follows up with Gamble, randomly discarding a known Swords to Plowshares. Ben then casts a Windfall, making us all discard our hands, and drawing a fresh 7. After that, he passes to Chris. Chris draws and plays a Mountain. He recasts Brion, and then plays a Mind Stone. Going to combat, he pokes Ben for 1 with a Dockside before passing. Shane plays a Swamp and casts Jet Medallion. He then plays another Shadow, putting another counter onto the Baku altar, and casts a Demonic Tutor. Going to combat, he pokes Ben for 2 with another team, and follows up with a Fell Spectre, making me discard a card, and I take 2. After that, Shane passes, while I activate Shorikai on his end step, and lose another 2 life as I discard a card to its ability. On my upkeep, I put a +1/+1 counter on my Razortide Bridge and Shorikai thanks to Katsumasa, and then draw for turn. I cast a Mobilizer mech and crew it up, which in turn crews up Shorikai. I then swing Shorikai at Chris, who responds by casting Path to Exile and targets my commander. I have no counter in hand and have to accept this, going to find a Plains from it and passing. Ben draws and plays a Reflecting Pool. He then casts Gaia's Blessing, shuffling in Intuition, Gamble, and Windfall, and then draws a card. After that, he passes. Chris draws and plays Battlefield Forge. He then plays a Luminous Broodmoth. Going to combat, he goes to poke Ben for 1, and Ben flashes in Kyodai to block. The Dockside dies but comes back with flying, and Chris gets 9 more treasure counters as it enters. Chris passes after that. Shane plays Diabolic Intent in his main phase, sacrificing the Nether Traitor and getting a treasure. He then plays a Cabal Coffers, and then casts Geth's Grimoire and Bloodchief Ascension. After that, he passes to me. I put a +1/+1 counter from Katsumasa onto my bridge and draw. I then play an island and cast a Nautiloid Ship, and as it enters, exile Chris's graveyard. I then recast Shorikai and pass to Ben. Ben has a Cephalid Colosseum for turn, and plays Nature's Lore to go and find Zagatha Triome. He passes after that. Chris's turn has a Sunbaked Canyon come in, and he equips the Illusionist Bracers to Brion, and the Skull Clamps to the Dockside, and then flings it at Shane. This deals 4 and draws him 2, and after that, Chris passes. Shane draws, and in his main phase casts a Name Death Aspect, which as it enters, goes into his library and puts to graveyard all the spirit creatures he has. He then activates Crypt of Agadim for a ton of black mana, and plays Patriarch's Bidding, naming Spirit. Chris fortunately has a Tybalt's Trickery, and ruins Shane's fun, as he flips into a Zulaport Cutthroat instead. Shane then uses the rest of his mana to play Sir Conrad, and then recasts He Who Hungers. He then sacrifices the Nether Shadow to He Who Hungers to deal 2 to everyone and gain 1 life. Shane also brings back the Nether Trader, which deals 1 to his opponents thanks to Sir Conrad seeing a creature leave from his graveyard. He then resolves the He Who Hunger triggers by looking at Chris's hand and forcing him to discard a card. He makes Chris discard Valakut Awakening, and then sacrifices the Nether Trader to do it to Chris again, taking Wear and Tear this time. After that, Shane goes to pass, and during his end step, Ben overloads a Cyclonic Rift, and Shane moves to discard while I take my turn. I draw and play SRAM, and then recast Nautiloid Ship, exiling Ben's graveyard. I then follow up with Ethereum Sculptor, and pass. During my end step, Ben casts Mystical Tutor, going to find a Windfall again. Ben draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard, sends his Divining Top, and then Windfall. We all then discard our hand, and draw 11 cards at this point. Ben then plays an Exploration, and plays out a Hall of Heliod's Generosity. He follows up with Sylvan Library, Scrabbling Claws, and Wheel of Fortune, and we get to wheel again, drawing 7 more new cards. Chris responds to this by dealing 4 to him with Boros Charm. After the wheel, Ben then gives Chris the Spirit from the Forbidden Orchard, and casts 3 visits for a basic forest, and passes. Chris goes to draw, and during his upkeep, Ben activates Scrabbling Claws and targets Shane. Chris then replays Brion, and swings 1 at Shane with a Spirit token. In his second main phase, Chris then casts a Thornblight Staff and passes. Shane draws and plays a Swamp. He activates Crypt of Agadim to cast Grim Haruspex and a Grave Sifter, bringing back Kakusho from his graveyard. Shane follows up with Shirei and uses Hirobi's Whisper to destroy Kyodai. And then replays He Who Hungers. He activates his commander, sacrificing the Grave Sifter, and looks at Ben's hand and makes him discard Jace the Mind Sculptor. After that, he passes. I draw and play an island. I then cast Soul Ring and overload Arise and Shine, animating all of my non-creature artifacts into creatures. I swing the ship and Ancient Den at Ben, taking him out and passing to Chris. Chris draws and equips the Thornblight Staff to Brion. He then plays a Phyrexian Dreadnought, flinging it with the trigger on the stack to Brion, dealing 12 to me and gaining 12 life. Chris then plays a Bloody Betrayal, stealing my Nautiloid Ship, and swings it at me, dropping me down to 10. He then flings it with Brion again, to bring me down to 1, and passes turn. Shane draws and sacrifices Shirei to He Who Hungers, making Chris discard Swords to Plowshares. He then sacrifices He Who Hungers to itself to do it again to Chris, and in addition gets to return Gravesifter with Soul Shift and has Chris discard a Preacher. Shane then plays a Toxic Deluge, putting 6 into it, and uses the Gravesifter trigger to bring back Junji. He then plays a Siphon Mind and Junji as well. He then recasts He Who Hungers, and casts Malakir Rebirth on Junji before sacrificing it, making us each discard 2 and lose 2, which will take me out of the game. Junji then comes back because of the Rebirth, and after that, Shane passes. Chris draws and plays Chaos Warp, targeting the Crypt of Agadim. Despite a pretty solid shuffle, Shane manages to flip into Crypt of Agadim again, and with that, Chris passes. Shane plays a Swamp and bashes Chris for 10. Shane then sacrifices He Who Hungers, and the Soul Shift trigger gets the Gravesifter back to his hand. He then recasts it, bringing back Sir Conrad to hand, and recasts Sir Conrad. Shane then replays He Who Hungers, and passes turn. Chris draws, and plays Mark of Mutiny targeting Sir Conrad, which has Shane responding by making everyone mill 6 with Sir Conrad. Only 1 creature gets milled unfortunately, dealing 1 to Chris. Chris then swings Sir Conrad at Shane for 6, and after that, passes. Shane draws and plays a Swamp, finally remembering a blood gas trigger and brings it back to the field. He then swings 16 points of damage at Chris and passes after that. Chris draws and plays a command tower, and then replays Brion and passes. During his end step, Shane casts Rend Flesh on Brion to take him out. Shane draws and swings all out at Chris again, dropping him down to 7. He then uses Sir Conrad to mill everyone for 10, which has Chris taking 3 more in the end. He then sacrifices Junji to have Chris discard 2 and lose 2, and then uses Goryo's Vengeance to bring Junji back and do it again for the win. Game review time. I love a good on-theme deck, and I think Shane did a fantastic job of building a Spirits Matter deck right down to the choice of basics. I wasn't too worried initially since I'm often more afraid of what Ben is playing, but as soon as Shane had some of his mana engines going with the Cabal Coffers and Crypt of Agadeem, he really got out of control. I probably should have been activating Shorikai a lot more aggressively, digging deeper into my library to hopefully find relevant vehicles. My favorite card in the deck has to be Rise and Shine, since it can turn all of my artifacts, of which there are many, into beaters, and as you saw, they can be potentially lethal. Ben's Kyodai deck unfortunately got neutered very early on. As he mentioned in the stream, after I used the Unlicensed Hurt to take out Untomb and Life from the Loam, he really lost a lot of staying power. I'm not sure what his win condition is, but it obviously involved lands being sacrificed or flung, and then bringing them back with Life from the Loam. I think Chris did a particularly good job with Brion's Stout Arm, stealing his opponent's creatures, and then flinging them at their respective faces. Unfortunately with a deck like this, I think he really needs to focus on one player as opposed to spreading the love, and it also seemed like by late game he was struggling to find engines to help him go. I think he needed a bit more draw, otherwise he would have been in a great position. This video wouldn't be possible without the help from my sponsors, Cool Stuff Inc., Multizone, Original Magic Art, and Alter Sleeves. But it definitely wouldn't be possible without the help from you, the viewers, and my patrons. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and to remember, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.